They weren't knights in shining armor. They were the warped, overtrained skeletons behind the bowstrings. Medieval archers were treated like tools, overused, underprotected, and discarded the moment their fingers stopped working. Their bodies broke before their bows ever did. And when the battle was over, nobody wrote songs about the man who pulled the string. This is why archers were the most broken men on the medieval battlefield. In medieval England, boys as young as 7 were handed bows taller than themselves and told to pull until their fingers bled. This wasn't play, it was preparation. By law, every able-bodied male had to practice archery every Sunday, a tradition that turned growing children into living siege engines long before they understood what war really was. The English longbow wasn't a simple tool. It was a weapon of war that demanded the body bend before it ever loosed a single arrow. Drawing a longbow required incredible strength, far beyond what most modern people realize. With draw weights often exceeding 100 pounds, each shot placed immense strain on the chest, shoulders, arms, and spine, muscle groups that were pushed to their limits hundreds of times per week. To pull one arrow was an effort. To loose dozens in quick succession was a feat of raw endurance that turned flesh into leather and bone into something closer to engineered wood. Over years, this repeated trauma warped the body into something unnatural. Skeletal remains of medieval archers show the evidence clearly. Left arms, used to grip the bow, grew longer and more heavily muscled than the right. Shoulders were pulled out of alignment, with the dominant side higher, tighter, and more compressed, while vertebrae twisted under decades of uneven pressure. The ribs on one side of the chest often bulged outward, flared by the repetitive motion of deep inhalation and massive muscular contraction. These men didn't just carry the effects of archery, they became their weapon. The training never stopped. Even outside of war, practicing the longbow was as routine as eating or praying. Peasants would aim at straw bales or wooden posts in village fields, rain or shine, with cracked fingers and stiff joints that grew worse with every winter. There was no such thing as ergonomic technique, just brute repetition until the body adapted or broke. And when the archers finally reached the battlefield, what they carried wasn't just a weapon, it was a deformity earned through years of pain. Archery drills focused not only on power, but on rhythm and speed. An experienced longbowman could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute, each with enough force to punch through armor or pin a horse's skull to its spine. But that kind of rapid fire came at a cost. Inflamed tendons, pulled muscles, and calluses so thick they cracked open like bark. Archers wrapped their fingers in leather, linen, or waxed cloth to slow the damage, but no protection lasted long under the tension of a warbow drawn again and again. These men weren't respected like knights. They were seen as tools, replaceable, expendable, and often unarmored, valued only for the havoc they could unleash from a distance. In war, they were expected to fire relentlessly for hours, raining death on enemy lines without pause or cover. When the fighting moved in close, they were told to drop their bows and run, or die. The longbow gave them power at a distance, but once the gap closed, it offered no protection, no second chance. Archers were punished harshly for failure. Those who flinched, misfired, or dropped arrows under pressure were beaten, demoted, or even executed for cowardice. Their entire identity was bound to the bow, and once their bodies gave out, through injury or age, they were discarded, often without pay or recognition. Unlike knights, they had no code of honor to retreat behind, no noble title to fall back on, just the bent spine, gnarled hands, and unspoken shame of a career built on violence. In the end, the archers of medieval warfare were not elite warriors in shining armor. They were biomechanical laborers of death, molded by discipline and mutilated by repetition. Their skill didn't come from privilege or strategy, but from pain practiced to the point of deformity. And though their arrows shaped the course of history, their names, and their bones, were left behind in shallow graves, still twisted by the very weapon that once made them useful. An archer could stop a knight with one arrow, but couldn't stop a sword from splitting his skull. That was the cruel paradox of medieval battlefield archery. A weapon powerful enough to break armor was often carried by men who wore none themselves. While knights rode into battle encased in steel, archers went to war in cloth, leather, and the blind hope that distance alone would protect them from the chaos they unleashed. Medieval armies didn't shield their archers, they exposed them. Placed at the front of armies or tucked behind rudimentary wooden stakes, archers were expected to fire rapidly and precisely, even while cavalry thundered toward them. They had no visors to lower, no mail to catch blades, and no horses to escape with. They stood on muddy hills with little more than speed, coordination, and the momentum of fear. And when the line broke, they were the first to fall. Each arrow they loosed had the potential to kill a nobleman in a single strike. Bodkin points could pierce chainmail, broadheads could sever arteries through padded gambesons. One volley could collapse a charge, blind a horse, or shatter a commander's strategy before it began. But while their arrows were feared, the men who fired them were considered expendable. They were viewed not as warriors, but as tactical devices, like firewood that happened to scream when it burned. When cavalry charged, archers rarely stood a chance. If they held position, they were trampled. If they fled, they were caught. Sometimes they were ordered to hold until the last moment, buying time for the infantry to regroup, knowing full well they were being sacrificed. In some battles, their own commanders built pits and sharpened stakes to slow enemy horses, not to protect the archers, but to prolong their usefulness for just a few more seconds. Their vulnerability didn't end when the arrows did. Once they ran out of ammunition, they were expected to fight hand-to-hand with knives, short swords, or even their bows held like clubs. They had no shields, no formation training, and little chance of surviving a melee. Most had trained their whole lives to pull strings, not parry blows. If they were lucky, they escaped. If they were slow, they died anonymously in the mud they'd once stood atop as kings of distance. Their deaths were often horrific, gored by horses, hacked by swords, or crushed under collapsing formations. Archers suffered the brutality of battle without its protections. Chroniclers rarely named them. Even in victory, they were counted in silence, their broken bodies piled beside those of the enemy, indistinguishable in death from the very men they had killed from afar. Their only legacy was the volley they fired moments before they vanished. Yet despite this, archers continued to show up, voluntarily or by conscription, driven by duty, desperation, or the hope that perhaps this time their skill might keep them alive. They refined their speed, tightened their accuracy, and trusted in the idea that distance was power. And for a fleeting moment in every battle it was. When 1,000 arrows darkened the sky and cut down charging knights like wheat, the battlefield belonged to the archers. But the moment those knights kept coming, the archers became targets without armor, warriors without protection, men without escape. In modern eyes, we might picture the longbowman as a sniper, cool and protected, picking enemies off from afar. But the truth is harsher. They were barefoot executioners at the front of the line, exposed by strategy, discarded by hierarchy, and broken by design. Every shot they fired brought death closer, not just for their enemy, but for themselves. The longbow didn't just break enemies, it broke the men who used it. Every pull of the bowstring was a small act of self-destruction, a motion that tore muscle fibers, frayed nerves, and ground joints down like millstones over bone. Archers didn't retire from service. They were forced out by injury, disfigurement, or the simple collapse of a body trained beyond its limits. The fingers of a seasoned longbowman told their own grim story. The drawstring left permanent grooves in the fingertips, cutting through calluses and reopening scar tissue that never had time to heal. Infection was common, especially in cold or wet campaigns, where open wounds turned black beneath the nails and fingertips stiffened into useless claws. Some archers wrapped their hands in oiled leather or linen soaked in vinegar, but nothing could stop the slow decay that came from thousands of hours of friction, strain, and blood. Their shoulders suffered most of all. Drawing a 100-pound warbow placed extraordinary torque on the rotator cuff and shoulder joint, tearing cartilage, overextending tendons, and warping the bones themselves over time. Chronic pain was constant, and many archers developed massive muscle on one side of their torso, while the other shrank in comparison, a grotesque asymmetry that followed them long after their last battle. Skeletons of known longbowmen show severe bone thickening in the right arm, collarbone and spine, as if one side of their body had aged twice as fast as the other.
Knees were ruined by years of kneeling, crouching and shifting under load. Archers didn't stand tall while firing. They braced themselves low to the ground,
reducing their profile and maintaining stability under tension. The result was cartilage loss, tendon inflammation, and a kind of early-onset arthritis that left men in their 30s walking like octogenarians. Once the shooting stopped, many couldn't climb stairs, farm fields, or even lift their own children without pain. Eyesight was another casualty. Years of squinting into sun, rain, and smoke dimmed vision early, especially in one eye, which was often dominant and strained by constant aiming. Peasants had no spectacles, no relief from fatigue, and no ability to recover from corneal abrasions caused by wind, sand, or snapped bowstrings. Some archers even went blind in one eye from repetitive stress or injury, ironically rendering them useless for the very skill that had destroyed them. And then there was the spine. Archers didn't just twist their torsos, they contorted them. The repetitive torque from drawing and releasing a heavy bow curved the spine sideways, a condition now known as archer's scoliosis. Over time, this led to chronic back pain, limited mobility, and a hunched posture that made sleeping, standing, and walking a form of ongoing punishment. The body quite literally bent to the bow, and once bent, it rarely unbent. Even their faces bore the marks. The jaw clenched with every shot, leading to worn molars and sometimes dislocated mandibles in older men who had never known a day without tension. Lips cracked in cold weather, noses broke from snapping strings, and cheeks developed permanent lines where wind and focus etched them over decades of repetition. There was no medical care for these men, only ale, prayer, and the hope that tomorrow's battle might kill them quickly. Archers weren't treated as wounded veterans. They were dismissed, ignored, and expected to return to farm work with bodies that could barely lift a sack of grain. No pensions, no thanks, just the pain of service and the silence of history. Their injuries weren't sudden. They were cumulative. Death by 1,000 arrows, but in reverse. Not inflicted, but absorbed. Because to become a master of the bow was to slowly carve yourself away, muscle by muscle, joint by joint, until there was nothing left but skill and scars. The longbow didn't just pull on tendons, it pulled on sanity. Archers lived in a mental twilight, stuck between precision and panic, their minds strained by a type of warfare that demanded total focus while delivering constant horror. They weren't shielded by armor or rank. They were exposed to everything. The screams, the gore, the smell of burning flesh, and the knowledge that every man they killed never saw it coming. Killing from a distance brought a strange kind of trauma. Unlike swordsmen who looked their victims in the eye, archers ended lives from hundreds of feet away, loosing arrows into faceless waves of soldiers and hearing them cry out seconds later. There was no moment of reckoning, no clash of blades to justify the act, just the weight of knowing your hands had ended something you couldn't even name. And then, you did it again. Dozens of times per minute, hundreds per day, until your arrows ran out or your nerve did. The noise alone was enough to break a man. Arrows didn't fly in silence, they screamed. And when thousands loosed at once, the air itself wailed like a banshee. Add to that the thundering of hooves, the crunch of bodies beneath boots, and the gurgling breath of dying men, and the battlefield became a chorus of chaos no mind could quiet. Archers couldn't look away. They had to watch their targets. And in watching, they saw everything. Some were forced to kill their own. During retreats, archers were ordered to fire into fleeing ranks to prevent desertion. That meant loosing arrows into men who had once trained beside them, eaten from the same pot, or shared shelter during stormy campaigns. Friendly fire wasn't an accident. It was policy, and it left wounds that no salve could reach. The mental toll didn't end when the fighting stopped. At night, archers lay on damp earth or straw, staring at the dark while their fingers twitched from phantom shots. Many developed tremors, stutters, or strange tics. Subtle signs of minds slowly fraying at the edges. Some grew withdrawn. others violent. There are accounts of veteran archers attacking townsfolk or refusing to speak entirely after returning home, unable to reconcile what they had done with what they were now expected to be. The worst part? They weren't honored. Knights were celebrated, swordsmen were remembered. But archers, those men who tipped the balance of entire battles, were ignored or treated with suspicion. Killing from afar was seen as cowardly by some and dishonorable by others. Even among allies, archers were seen as tools, not warriors. No tales were sung about the man in the back who brought down a charging noble with a single arrow. Glory went to the men who bled up close. Archers were left with only the blood on their hands and the ghosts in their heads. Religious guilt compounded the trauma. Many archers were devout, taught from youth that murder was sin, yet paid to commit it in bulk. Some priests blessed the arrows before battle, turning slaughter into sacrament. Others refused to absolve archers, branding them unclean or godless. For a man who killed 30 in one day, the promise of hell was never far behind. It wasn't just fear of death, it was fear of what came after, and whether the souls you'd ended would be waiting for you on the other side. Medieval society offered no comfort. There was no therapy, no treatment, no understanding. Trauma was called weakness. And men who shook during storms or cried in sleep were ridiculed, beaten, or cast out as mad. So archers kept quiet. They carried their wounds inside their skulls, hidden behind weathered eyes and silence that deepened with age. Because what no one wanted to admit was this: the longbow didn't just bend the body, it warped the mind. And by the time an archer's career was done, what remained was often no longer a man, but a shell held together by memory, regret, and muscle memory carved into bone. On paper, archers were essential. On the battlefield, they were the first to die. Despite being the tactical backbone of many medieval armies, archers were treated as expendable assets, deployed to maximize impact early and discarded the moment they became a liability. They weren't just the first into position, they were often the last to be protected. Commanders placed archers at the front of the line, hidden only by stakes or slight ridges of earth, precisely because they didn't wear armor and could move quickly. But when the tides turned, those same commanders didn't wait for the archers to retreat. They pulled back the cavalry. They signaled the infantry. The archers were left to run or to be run over. In military terms, they were a buffer zone. In human terms, they were bait. If the battle was won, archers were praised in vague terms. Our bowmen softened the charge, or the arrows carried the day. If the battle was lost, they were barely mentioned. No one wrote songs for the men who bled without shields. No statues were carved for those who died before the melee began. Archers disappeared into mud, smoke, and forgetfulness, too common to be counted, too poor to be remembered. They weren't given horses to escape. They weren't given retainers to guard them, and they weren't given any assurance that help would come if they fell behind. During retreats, some commanders deliberately blocked the archers' path with cavalry formations, forcing them to either stand and die or scatter into the countryside like hunted animals. If they survived, they returned to camp alone, exhausted, broken, and blamed for having run. When captured, archers were treated worse than knights or men-at-arms. Nobles could be ransomed. Archers were often executed on the spot, especially if they were known to have killed high-ranking opponents. In some cases, captured archers had their fingers cut off or their eyes gouged out. Brutal punishments designed to ensure they would never draw a bow again. These weren't war crimes. They were standard practice. Even within their own ranks, archers were seen as second class. They were paid less, fed worse, housed apart from the elite. And when resources ran low, they were the first to go without boots, blankets, or medicine. A sick knight was nursed. A sick archer was replaced. And yet the military depended on them. Without archers, enemy cavalry would trample the front line. Without their rain of arrows, infantry formations would collapse under the weight of brute force. Archers shaped the battle before it began, and often decided whether it ended in victory or slaughter. But the men behind the bows never saw the fruits of their work. They saw only the bruises, the blood, and the backs of their comrades fleeing as they stood alone. Desertion was common, not because archers lacked courage, but because they understood the game. They knew they were pawns, not players, and pawns are the first to fall. Many deserted not during battle but before it, slipping away under cover of darkness, hiding in forests, or pretending to be dead until it was safe to run. Some were caught and executed, others were never seen again. Worse still was how quickly they were forgotten. Their names were rarely recorded unless they committed a crime or achieved an impossible feat. Even then, praise was fleeting. Once their draw arm gave out or their shoulder failed, they were discharged without ceremony, sent back to villages that had nothing waiting for them but stiff benches and suspicious looks. Some became guards, others turned to crime. Most simply faded. They were soldiers without legacy, warriors without honor, weapons without memory. And in the grand narratives of medieval warfare, they're barely footnotes, flattened by history just as they were flattened by war horses on the battlefield. Because in truth, archers weren't just underappreciated, they were disposable by design, built up by routine, burned out by service, and discarded with cold efficiency the moment they stopped being useful. The army needed their arrows, but not their lives. Victory didn't mean rest, it meant rejection. When the arrows stopped flying and the banners were lowered, archers didn't return home to celebration or security. They returned to villages where they no longer fit, carrying bodies too warped for labor and minds too frayed for peace. In a world that valued the strong, the useful, and the honorable, ex-archers were none of the above. Their injuries were permanent. Shoulders locked, hands trembled, knees refused to bend. Men in their 30s walked like they were 80, spines twisted by years of asymmetrical strain. They could no longer farm or build or swing an axe, not because they were lazy, but because their muscles had been trained into a single unnatural function. Drawing a bow had consumed every part of them. And when that task was no longer needed, the body had nothing else left to offer. Work was scarce. Nobles didn't hire broken soldiers unless they could guard something quietly and die without complaint. Townsfolk viewed them with suspicion, men who had lived too long in the company of blood, death, and violence. Even their families sometimes kept their distance. Children didn't understand why their fathers wept at loud noises or flinched when touched. Wives grew resentful of the hunched, angry stranger who came home in place of the young man who had left. Many archers became beggars. Their deformities were visible, their stories too grim for sympathy. They sat outside churches and taverns with hands still calloused, asking for coins from people who had never seen war but judged it anyway. Some wandered from town to town, sleeping under bridges or in barns, ignored by the same society that had once demanded everything from them. They weren't honored veterans. They were excess inventory. Those who tried to reintegrate found themselves broken twice, once by war and again by normalcy. They couldn't keep up with harvests. They couldn't lift crates. They couldn't focus, and they couldn't forget. War had trained them to be alert at all times, to anticipate danger, to act without hesitation. That instinct didn't go away. It lingered in peaceful moments like a poison, turning laughter into paranoia, routine into restlessness, and memory into something sharp and sudden. Some turned to drink, others to violence. A few were hired as mercenaries, trading one war for another, unable to live outside the rhythm of campaign life. These men drifted toward the shadows of society, used again by those who needed killers without conscience or cost. They became guards for corrupt nobles, thugs for local barons, or worse, men who lived off fear because it was the only currency they still understood. No pensions existed, no monuments were built. The state didn't remember them, and the church rarely forgave them. They were left with nothing but aching joints, distant stares, and the ghosts of those they had killed from a distance. The same longbow that had given them power on the battlefield had robbed them of usefulness everywhere else. It made them feared, and then it made them obsolete. Some tried to teach the next generation, boys who admired the idea of an archer but didn't understand the cost. These veterans passed on their skills with caution, warning not of battle tactics, but of what it meant to be used and then discarded. You'll kill many, they said, "but none of them will remember your name. And when your arm gives out, no one will carry you home." In the end, broken archers didn't die in glory. They faded, bent by war, hollowed by time, forgotten by history. Their lives reduced to one task, one weapon, and one truth. The battlefield doesn't break cleanly, and neither does a man. They didn't wear crowns or command armies, but they broke kingdoms one arrow at a time. Not with strength, but with repetition. Not with glory, but with quiet endurance that bent their bodies, blurred their minds, and left them forgotten the moment the battlefield fell silent. Archers weren't warriors. They were tools, shaped, strained, and shattered by war. So next time you see a painting of a medieval battle, look past the knights. Look for the man without armor, the one with crooked shoulders and trembling fingers. Because if you had to survive that world, would you rather hold the sword or pull the string?